I'm actually most excited for the transformation that I would expect in music production, because you have way more space to fill with your sounds, and then how to utilize compression, dynamic compression, how to utilize the EQ. This is all different when you have the full surrounding space.
I've got Thomas Görne here, a professor here at HAW in Hamburg, Germany. You're one of the experts in the field when it comes to immersive audio. So could you tell me a little bit of a history of immersive audio and maybe weave in how you got involved into this industry?
Thank you for letting me participate in this. We are now sitting here in our immersive audio lab, equipped with a 33 loudspeaker dome that we use for mostly aesthetic research in immersive audio. So following the question, the history of immersive audio, if we skip those historical examples from the late 19th century, I think we could track it back to Alan Blumlein and the idea of stereophonic recording. He describes the idea of bringing virtual sources into space, which is basically one idea of immersive audio or spatial audio. So we have different names for this. This all starts with stereo, because this allows us to create a virtual stage constructed from two loudspeakers, where we have then the area to position sources on this virtual stage, which is in front of the listener typically, and spans some horizontal area from between the loudspeakers and then in the depth, so behind the loudspeakers. The substantial developments in immersive technologies or spatial technologies were then mostly related to film, as film has always been an immersive medium. And I think it was compelling. It was always compelling to find an audio format, audio production and playback format to match this idea of the immersive medium. Then very famously, Fantasia, Disney, 1940s, multi-channel playback, which back then was brought into the theaters with mobile technology, because there was no theater equipped with those. Then in the 1970s were the experiments with quadraphonic recording and playback for music, which was not successful, maybe because it was simply too expensive. Is simply just twice as much as stereo, so one would have to buy 4 equal loudspeakers instead of 2, and a 4-channel amplifier or 2 stereo amplifiers, so twice as much as stereo. And a decent home stereo system was never really cheap. So this might have been the biggest drawback, although there have been quite interesting music releases for quadraphonic audio. But then the system was not commercially successful. There were experiments going on with multi-channel audio for film, like analog 6-track, too expensive, too complicated. And then I think it was Dolby who came up with the idea to take the already well-known system of stereo quadraphonic recording and playback, which basically means storing 4 channels of audio on 2 physical channels, and utilize this for surround, for film. 4-channel surround, left, center, right surround, 4 channels. In principle, something like using the then good old quadraphonic technology and rotate it by 45 degrees. With films like Star Wars, I think this was the first film released 1977 with this new surround sound system. This was like the kickoff for large-scale multi-channel sound production, which is today the standard for film sound. It was never accepted in the music production world, only for film production.
And that makes sense, right? Because when we think about the mindset someone is in for viewing a film, you want to be immersed just by nature of what you're doing. I think the same goes for video games. You really want to be immersed in that moment.
Yeah.
Whereas even in the real world, when we listen to music, we're typically listening to an ensemble that's in front of us,
Yes.
which can really be quite well mimicked by stereo, by just two speakers left and right.
Yes, I think there's a very important point. So we're used to the scheme of having the music in front of us on a stage because this mimics the actual situation in a concert. So the creatively challenging experiments with quadraphonic sound, like, for example, Miles Davis' Bitches Brew in quadraphonic with moving sources around the listener and stuff, was then very different. But maybe this was not captivating enough for the average listener.
Was there a turning point along that progression of technology that really excited you? Or did you have some emotional response to a specific album that made you say, this is something I want to focus on? Because you've done extensive work. And so I imagine that there is something like that for you.
Yeah. So my own professional career in audio started with film, and I did work quite some time in film post-production and did film mixing, some re-recording. So I was working with then 5-channel surround, which was and still is a decent system for at least for film. And so I was always attracted to the possibilities of surround sound and getting the listener within a scene, in contrast to just being some observer in a certain distance to a scene. And then when I started working in the university, we got in contact with then the audio research group of Technicolor that was involved in the development of higher order Ambisonics as a standard system for content production and content distribution. And this led us in the university to start working with higher order Ambisonics as well, which naively starts with height channels, but then gives access to the full 360 sphere if one would like to work with this. And then we started very, very early with the creative experiments, aesthetic experiments. So utilizing 360 production techniques for film, for music, for sonic arts, for sound art. And then I got seriously in contact with sonic arts or sound art, acoustic arts that have been utilizing spatial technologies or immersive technologies ever since the 1950s. So as early as technology was available, it has been used by artists, but then only for live staging of concerts, of electronic concerts, and not for the production and distribution of content. So the technologies that we're using have been known since the 1950s, but only for very, very limited audience, never for like everyone, and it was never possible to broadcast stuff like this. But they did use in the 50s, in the 60s, lots of loudspeakers on the stage and around the audience. And today, what's one of the most interesting points is to apply the aesthetics of sonic arts of the 1950s, 60s, 70s to mainstream production, like pop music.
In what way?
By asking the question, how do we utilize space in music? How do we utilize space different from this frontal stage paradigm? So if we want to create something different than the frontal stage with virtual musicians distributed on the stage, playing to me in kind of a virtual concert, and then this is one way of producing 3D music, to use the 360 possibilities, the immersive possibilities, to recreate a virtual space around us, like a virtual concert hall. In contrast, we might think of music composed of abstract sounds and then distribute those sounds in space. Working with, for example, the height metaphor, there are beautiful approaches in sonic arts, for example, decomposing complex sounds according to pitch and then sorting them vertically. And of course, one important element that we can use in spatial audio that basically does not work in stereo is movement. In a stereo production, spatial movement quite often appears a bit silly, like why is the guitar moving on the stage? So if there is no actual reason for this, then one should not do this. But this is different in fully immersive formats. Then we appear to perceive spatial movement differently. It might even happen that we don't notice that sources are moving, but we only notice a different impression of space around us.
In film, a clear example would be like a plane flying by.
Yes.
That's an object flying by. But in music, whereas flying by guitars might be cool for maybe a remix of a Jimi Hendrix album, it could also be used to create dimension just generally and with reverbs and with spatial awareness for the listener. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yes, absolutely. So my background is film, and this is my personal starting point. And for film, the surround technology is beautiful and works really, really good, but in a limited way. So we are still fixed to the frontal image. So we have a straight front and rear distinction in the space, in the performance space in the theater. And we should not use the surrounding space, the audience surrounding space for other things than like helping to tell the story or helping with the immersive experience of the film. But in music, and specifically with the newest technologies of binaural playback, including head tracking, we can get far beyond this idea of there's a front, there's a rear, but only let the audience explore a sounding space and then use the music to create the space. I think this would not work with all music, and this would not work with all genres and not all instruments, but it does work for a number of genres and instruments.
We started with stereo, where it was left, right, and there are some panning principles there that have to do with loudness and time of arrival from the left and right. And then we advanced into quadraphonic, and then we went into some 5.1, 7.1.
And we might say in parallel, besides all those standard formats, there have been the artistic experiments, multi-channel experiments with simply distributed loudspeakers and custom panning devices and spatial panning devices and loudspeakers around the audience for live events of sonic arts and electronic music. Then there were theoretical developments and lab experiments with first-order Ambisonics, 1970s as well, but not introduced into like serious studio technology until recent years, if we just skip the adaptation of Ambisonics for the sound field microphone, which is a different usage of similar technology.
Yeah. One thing that I think has prevented widespread adoption is the fact that in any speaker system, the configuration and the setup is extremely important. So not only do you need the left and right speaker to be to the left and right in order to achieve that stereo image, but when you add even more speakers, you first off need them to be spaced where that speaker is designed to be spaced within that given configuration.
Exactly.
But also
yes,
the
yes.
time of arrival differences. It's asking a lot of a person watching a film at home
Yes.
to set all this up. We'll get back to the conversation with Thomas in just a moment. If you want to ensure you're setting up your surround sound system properly, you can download a free speaker placement guide at audiouniversityonline.com/speaker placement guide. This quick guide shows you where to position your speakers for any system, from 2.1 stereo all the way up to a 9-channel system with multiple overhead speakers. All right, back to the conversation with Thomas Görne. And that's what excites me about what you were getting at, which is HRTFs. How can we bring a 360-degree experience to someone with just headphones? Something that's very common and very easy to configure. You put headphones in your ears and you're done, right?
Yes, absolutely. So we might expect immersive audio to be the next big thing, simply because now the technology is available and because everybody can experience this with headphones. It's basically independent of the production system. If you produced like channel-based, multi-channel 3D audio, or within the Ambisonics domain is three-dimensional sound field, or object-based complex composition of positions in space with their respective sources connected. But this all can be played back via headphones if you can bring a virtual head with virtual ears in this virtual space and let this virtual head listen to this sound field independent of how it has been created. So the result will then always be 2-channel format. We might not call this stereo, but binaural.
I have a video on binaural audio, and when I first learned about it, it was in terms of binaural recording, where you had a binaural microphone, which were 2 microphones embedded in either a head or some sort of apparatus that had outer ear.
Yes.
It had a baffling mechanism that if a sound was coming from over here, it would sound nice and clear, let's say, to this ear. And then to this ear, it would be shadowed by the head. And I was amazed at how realistic. I mean, you close your eyes, and have you heard of this virtual barbershop?
Yes.
I remember the first time I heard that.
This is so famous.
It's a moment where you open your eyes and you're a little bit surprised that you're not really sitting there. And that's something I'm passionate about. I get chills talking about it.
Yes.
What's amazing now is that things don't have to be recorded with a binaural microphone in order for that to happen. You were telling me that you're doing research where you can measure someone's unique HRTF, head-related transfer function, that basically describes or represents the transfer function that is related to that person's head. Right?
Which is very individual.
Yeah, you had also mentioned that while we were walking through that there are generic HRTFs, which are sort of, I guess, the average of everyone. And that may or may not work for you. But if you can somehow find a way to have your own unique head structure profile, then that listening experience can be even more realistic and more similar to how you've experienced the world just in your everyday life. Is that correct?
Yeah. The magic of binaural audio to me starts with the illusion that is created by means of the disturbance of the sound field with one's head and ears. So what you're describing, that the sound arriving from one side would be nice and clear on one side, but then shadowed and a bit later due to the distance and due to the shadowing of the head. On the other side, this is what we would measure. And then if we take actual looks at the then 2-channel transfer functions that we get, then we find from perspective of audio technology, this is weird filter functions like 20 decibels difference between the ears at certain frequencies. But we do not perceive any coloration of sound. We perceive space. We perceive a position in space. And the new technology is that this all can be created in the digital domain. So we don't need this dummy head microphone or probe microphones in our own ears.
Yeah, and some people may be asking, okay, does that mean to make a mix more immersive, I need to put a deep EQ on this thing over here to somehow mimic those filters.
Yeah.
Well, no, you can build your mix with a surround sound physical speaker setup if you have one in your studio.
Yeah.
But new technologies such as Sony 360 Reality, such as Dolby Atmos, these allow you to just basically pan something, for lack of a better word, in a virtual space, which will then be adapted to different speaker systems, including a binaural setup. That's what's really exciting because now, getting back to what I was saying, that obstacle of someone setting up the speakers in a very specific way, that's been eliminated because now the file you're listening to itself can be adapted to whatever you're listening to, even if that's just two headphones.
Right, like Dolby Atmos, or for those who like to save the license fees, higher order Ambisonics as open source system, creating 360 immersive sound field and then rendering, for example, for headphones in real time, where you can actually move inside this virtual sound field, which adds to the realism of the whole thing.
Interesting. This is something that I heard when researching your school, that you guys are doing some research in head tracking as well.
Kind of a bit, yeah.
Okay.
How important is head tracking, or allowing the listener to turn their head in a sound field that then remains static, in contrast to what we call head-locked audio, head-locked binaural, where we have this binaural content with this impression of 360 degrees sound sources around us, but then when we move, the positions move relative together with us. So it's, of course, way more realistic if we are allowed to turn the head. And as soon as we are allowed to turn the head, we lose the information what's in front of us, because front is always the direction where we're looking at.
If you've ever listened to the spatial audio that Apple is doing with some sources, it can take maybe a mono source or a stereo source, and it sort of knows where you're looking. But imagine where this goes for video games and for cinema. Can you walk around the space and explore, and you hear the dialogue happening? Do you think that's where things go next with head tracking and things like that? Or what innovations do you foresee, and are you most excited for?
I'm actually most excited for the transformation that I would expect in music production. As soon as we turn to full 360 immersive formats, we can forget everything we know about music production, because every trick and workflow that we learn to adopt for creating music in stereo might not work anymore, might not be necessary, or might not give us the desired effect. If immersive audio is then accepted widely in the music production community, then this must have an impact on the music itself, like the transition from mono to stereo. I think the majority of music productions that we have today are deliberately created for stereo and composed for stereo and arranged for stereo. If you start with the same material, with the same composition, and try to like upmix to immersive formats, then you might, for example, end up with not enough sounds, because you have way more space to fill with your sounds. And then the ideas of how to utilize compression, dynamic compression, how to utilize the EQ, this is all different when you have the full surrounding space.
Very interesting point. I hadn't considered that you check your mix in mono, because some bad things happen when you go to mono. There's one speaker now trying to recreate everything. And when you spread that to stereo, it's a bit easier. You can, instead of using an EQ cut or compressing the dynamic range of an instrument, you can just pan it over to this way and it creates that space. But you're saying now that we expand the canvas even more, we may be able to mix with
Exactly.
wider dynamic ranges.
Exactly.
And that may have implications
Yeah.
on the tonality of
Yes,
instruments,
yes.
which is something that's kind of plagued music for a long time, in many people's opinion, is the compression, the over-compression, some would say. And so perhaps
Yeah.
this widening of the canvas is our answer.
This might be one beautiful answer, because it was lots of those production tricks developed in the past decades were meant to just make space for one more sound and let us hear everything. But then if you have this huge canvas, way bigger, then it's easier to have space for all sounds to be heard. This is kind of similar, not the same, but maybe a bit kind of similar, what we experience in film sound production, where the sounds today are typically created for 5-channel. As soon as we down mix to stereo, we might get issues, because then the dialogue might get lost a bit, and so on and so on. This incompatibility of formats is something that I would expect for immersive. So a music production that has been composed for immersive formats and has been produced in immersive formats would then suffer kind of from stereo playback.
Stereo through speakers, I see what you mean.
Stereo
in
through
headphones,
speakers. Yes,
we could
yes,
just go
of
to
course.
binaural.
Yes,
but
yes.
in speakers, it's still stereo. Right?
We can argue about the transition from mono to stereo in music production, and the early days of stereo, where in pop music they made different mixes, and then maybe like with the majority of the Beatles releases, for example, the main format has still been mono, and then they created stereo as a secondary release, and then we might argue which version suits the music better.
I've heard many argue that. So I know that from your work, you're passionate about the emotional impact that audio can have on the listener. Do you think that this is an opportunity for us to expand the impact that music or film can have? Or do you think we should stay? I know the answer. Do you think we should stay with mono, go back to mono, right? Or do you think that this proposes an opportunity for us to improve the immersiveness and maybe therefore the emotional impact of our productions? And how so?
At least one might say that research suggests that immersive technologies help to increase the emotional impact of content. And this is true for video, so comparing frontal 2D with immersive 3D. One of the strongest factors for music production to create emotional impact is the perceived distance. In stereo music production, we're used to work with metaphors of distance and proximity, like bring up the bass and, for example, record a voice at low level and then bring it in the mix with little or no reverb and record it with increased low end. Although in loudspeaker playback, the actual distance would then be the distance of the loudspeakers. We would perceive this as close to us simply because...
Yeah, we're mimicking the proximity effect.
We're mimicking the proximity effect. We're mimicking like someone singing in our ears. Something that has not been explored yet in music production is the proximity that we can create, the closeness that we can create by means of binaural production. You already mentioned the barbershop audio clip, which gets its impact through the closeness of the sounds. I think we're still lacking some tools for the virtual binaural production. So this, of course, can be easily done with the dummy head recording, then coming very close to the dummy head. But what we then would need are tools for creating this in the mix with the pre-recorded sound. But then getting sounds like for example, the singer's voice in a perceived distance of like arm length or even closer. Again, this would result in different production techniques, because then this metaphor of closeness created by mimicking a voice that is close would be replaced by a voice that's close.
Yeah, so it seems like these new technologies will open the door to, instead of media and content in general being either third person or second person, on the audio front, we're close to the ability to have first person experiences to a new level. What are the current limitations to a listener or a viewer being fully immersed in an experience? And what technologies are coming up to address that?
Talking of loudspeaker playback, I think it's quite clear. So we need spaces that are equipped with lots of loudspeakers and rendering machines for this. So this will always be limited to certain spaces where one could experience like immersive content. Of course, there is the binaural playback, but this is still limited due to the very individual experience that people get with this specifically rendered content. So the individualization of the transfer function, like listening with my own virtual head in the virtual scenery, would be the necessary next step in the technological development. And then maybe not everyone wants to listen with headphones. So at least today we are in a situation where at least more music is heard via headphones than via loudspeakers. So this helps a lot with distributing immersive content. For those who would prefer listening through loudspeakers, like at home, don't want to run around wearing headphones all the time, then binaural content in principle can be played back via loudspeakers if you would then have a more or less complicated system running in the background compensating for crosstalk between the ears. There are technologies around that can handle this, but not yet widely available.
Yeah. Sounds to me like the most elegant solution is going to be binaural. For me, one thing that scares me about that is that requires some sort of intermediary rendering. What I like about stereo is that you make two audio files and you play them back, and that's inherently open source. I mean, it's very simple. What I don't want to happen is for one company to have complete control over all audio experiences because you have to use their renderer. I don't know if that'll happen, but these are challenges I think we'll face.
Yes, and as a content producer, you might say you have now the choice of either render for binaural playback, but then necessarily the content will be head locked. So you would lose the option of head tracking. And if you want to produce for headphones that allow the listener to move their heads with head tracking and stuff, then yes, you would have to rely on some third-party real-time rendering. At least there's some stuff going around already. So, for example, the widely used VLC player can already play back, I think, third-order Ambisonics live with head tracking. We might expect more of those options in the software and hardware.
Obviously, you guys have great facilities here at HW Hamburg, and there are many facilities and institutions that you can learn from in your own country, I'm sure. Ambisonics, it seems like that's something that you should definitely be aware of.
Yes, it's open source, so the tools are open source, the system is open source, so it's very easy for everyone to at least start with immersive audio.
Okay. And are there any other tools, resources, or just anything else that you'd like to direct people toward if they're interested in learning more about this?
Yes, if you would like to experiment with kind of object-based direct to binaural, there's a beautiful, again, open source tool, which is Anaglyph. This is the outcome of a long-term joint research project. This is a plugin that you use then in your DAW in place of the standard panning. And it allows you even to load your own HRTF if you have one available, or choose from various HRTFs and then play around with simulated head movements, play around with simulated listening spaces around the head. So this is a beautiful tool, and I would encourage everyone to start at least with open source tools that are available.
I will get a link from you on that, or I'll find a link and I'll put that in the description. There's no excuse now, and I love it, right? You don't need tens of thousands of dollars worth of speakers and amplifiers. You don't need some special interface or even DAW that allows you to put out multi-channels. All you need now is an open source plugin, a pair of headphones, and you can start making extremely realistic recordings.
This is something that I really love about immersive audio. So we have different studios here in our facilities, and they have impressive gear everywhere. But then the most humble studio that we have is the most modern studio, which is basically just a computer and some open source plugins. And this is it.
Thank you so much for your time, Thomas. I think that this is going to help a lot of people. Next time I'm in Germany, we'll meet and talk again, okay?
Looking forward to it.